I'm Nicholas Ballasy with JustTheNews.com. Joining me now is Congressman Tom Massie. Congressman, thanks for taking some time to speak with me.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Really appreciate it. So there's a lot happening in the news. There's a lot happening in Congress. I first wanted to start with asking you about House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer. He's been talking about how Congress should be virtual by now. In situations like the pandemic that we're going through right now, do you see that happening? What's your position on the remote voting, remote hearings, and doing that all virtually in Congress right now?
Well, I prefer they show up for work in person. On March 27th, I called them all back to work. I said, if truckers and nurses and farmers and grocery store workers are working, then surely congressmen making $174,000 a year with free travel can show up for work. So I prefer to do it in person, but if they don't want to do it in person or they can't do it in person, then we should be doing this stuff telephonically or by teleconference. Look, every school child in the United States is attending school online. There are billions of dollars of banking transactions happening today, and even the Pentagon is doing telework. If the Pentagon can telework, then why can't Congress?
Now, your own party, you've got McCarthy, the GOP leader, saying there's cyber concerns with remote voting and conducting business virtually because there have been so many attempted intrusions into the congressional systems. What's your view on that? Are there national security concerns when it comes to conducting business in Congress, as well as actually voting and doing floor business on the floor virtually?
Well, if you're worried about somebody spying on your backroom deal, I guess that could be a concern. But look, what we do in Congress, 90% of it is publicly televised, as it should be. And really the only problem there might be a denial of service attack. And I think we could get around that, because C-SPAN broadcasts, it doesn't matter if they're, broadcasting remotely or from the hearing room. But no, I think what you're seeing, and I believe actually Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer don't really want to work remotely either. I believe what you're seeing is pushback from leadership because they can't twist people's arms through a telephone or through a teleconference. The sort of stuff they walk up to you and whisper in your ear, like, good luck with your election. Those intimidation things, they can't do over the phone. They also can't separate you from your legislative council. When I walk on the floor of the House, I can't bring staff with me, but the leadership gets to bring their staff. And so they're at an advantage when we start talking about what's in the bill oftentimes. And they don't want to give up that advantage either. So, finally, the other thing is they love to do voice votes and unanimous consent. But if you're going to do it remotely, of course it has to be recorded to each member in order to be secure. And they don't want to give up their excuse to have voice votes and unanimous consent passage of bills.
How often does that go on, the arm twisting on the floor, even at the last minute before the vote's actually cast?
C-SPAN doesn't show the roster that we get to see in the House of Representatives that shows how every person has voted. But I think it would be fascinating if people could watch the members change their votes in real time, which happens on the floor. If a bill's not passing and they want it to pass and they're only 10 votes short, they'll walk around and twist arms and get people to change their votes. That would be really hard to do by teleconference. And yet it happens all the time on consequential bills that are close votes in the House of Representatives.
So you think because of that issue and that situation, that's why we haven't seen an actual remote voting plan enacted? Is that where you're going with that?
Yeah, I mean, the defense that they present, whether it's Steny Hoyer, or Nancy Pelosi, or Kevin McCarthy, is incompetence. They're saying they can't do what every school child in the United States is doing right now. In other words, work online. I think it's a bad defense. The reality is they're covering up for what their real motive is, and their real motive is it's harder for them to do all of the things they've learned in the swamp if they have to do it remotely.
Do you think personally they'll actually come up with a plan during this pandemic, to conduct business remotely, or do you think that it's not going to happen?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, they said we were going to vote on it, on doing like proxy votes. And then they said, well, we're not going to do it because the Republicans are opposed. Well, guess what? That's never stopped them before. You know, we're in the minority. If they had the support of the Democrats, they could have passed it. The reality is, I think they were bluffing our side, and they didn't really want to do remote voting either. So when our side put up some objections, they folded very quickly. And so I think that's what you're seeing is bluffing. I also think you're seeing a little bit of bluffing on our side when you hear Kevin McCarthy repeating my talking points now, saying that we should come to work, that we, you know, if Americans are working, basically his talking points sound just like mine at this point. If truckers and nurses and farmers and grocery store workers are working, then Congress should work. The reality is they'd rather write the bill alone and then invite us back when it's time to vote on it. But my question is, if they're going to invite us back to vote when the bill's ready to vote on, who the hell's writing the bill? I mean, the American public hopefully can see through what goes on in Congress during these times when they see that we only come back for 8 hours to vote on a bill and then we go back to our districts.
Yeah, you took some heat from the President of the United States for wanting the recorded vote and going out front on that and saying, I'm coming back to Washington in person. And people were citing health concerns that, you know, members shouldn't be coming back during the pandemic. Why do you think you got the heat you did from the President of the United States? And has your view of the president changed at all because of that situation?
Well, my view of the president hasn't changed. Look, I think he was being misled and misinformed. People thought I was trying to delay the bill, when in fact, all I wanted was a recorded vote, and I wanted people to show up for work. And that's why I transmitted my intentions a day before I actually made the procedural motion, so that there would be no surprises. Look, surprises are for little kids at birthday parties, not for Congress. And so I told them what I was going to do. Now, the president got upset because he thought I might single-handedly tank the bill. That wasn't the case. But now you hear the president saying what I said on March 27th. He said Congress needs to get back to work. They need to show up and vote on these bills. And he's right about that. And I was right about it on March 27th. So no hard feelings here from Kentucky.
Well, when it comes to health concerns, if the members don't come in person and then there's no remote voting or system set up to conduct business remotely, then they do things like unanimous consent, voice voting. Do you think that's appropriate to do on a spending bill, especially ones that could be in the $1 trillion range, like the fourth package we might see soon?
You know, unanimous consent and voice votes might be appropriate for some procedural motions or for renaming a post office with a non-controversial name, but they're not appropriate for the biggest spending bill in the history of mankind. And so we've got to vote one way or another, whether it's remote, whether it's by proxy, or whether it's showing up for work. And also, you know, once you get inside that Capitol complex, it's probably the most secure office space in the world. Like, have the guards tested for COVID if you're worried about catching it from the guards, and then test all the members, and then put us all in that box, because it's a very safe and controlled environment. I don't know what they're afraid of. If members are afraid of each other, then get each other tested. But we're doing the nation's business. Look, there was a time not too long ago when they had a plan to stick us all inside of a mountain in West Virginia if things got really bad. Now the plan is to tell us to stay home and eat ice cream.
Did you like the way they handled the last vote on the PPP added funding? Was that well done in your mind, or would you have liked to see some changes there?
Well, at least the last vote got a recorded vote, and at least all of Congress showed up. Now, they blame me on March 27th for endangering everybody's lives, but who endangered their lives a couple of weeks ago when we actually showed up and voted? In fact, Kevin Brady asked for the recorded vote himself. They didn't want to even let me request the recorded vote. They knew the optics were bad. And so I agree with having the recorded vote. What they didn't do properly is we didn't have a debate on that bill in the committees of jurisdiction. And they also glommed together a bunch of different subjects into one bill. We need to have one subject per bill, And those bills need to be marked up in the committees of jurisdiction, and there need to be hearings.
You've mentioned that they stripped an old bill in the Senate and sent it over for the $2.2 trillion CARES Act. Could you talk a little bit about that for people who may not understand that process? Why did it originate in the Senate and not the House? And do you think that may repeat again with this fourth package that Pelosi saying could be between $1 and $2 trillion?
So on this last coronavirus bill, they subverted the spirit of the Constitution. The Constitution requires all spending or revenue-based bills to originate in the House of Representatives. The founders only wanted to allow the People's House to pass taxes. Well, they subverted that a few weeks ago by taking a House bill that had already passed, bringing it over to the Senate, stripping every word from the bill, and inserting the coronavirus bill, the CARES Act, into that. And that's how they got around the origination clause in the Constitution. And that's how they were able to originate it in the Senate. Then the House voted on it after that. I think we need to go back to the Constitution and originate these bills in the People's House. It might be a little bit messier than that, but that's the way the Constitution calls for it. And by the way, this is exactly how they passed Obamacare. You know, Obamacare, the courts ruled was a tax, but conservatives protested that it had originated in the Senate. But what they did with Obamacare is they took a bill that had to do with veterans housing that had passed the House, and they stripped the language from that and started Obamacare in the Senate.
So they treat it like a shell bill almost, where they put stuff inside of it and originated in the Senate. And then we see things like the added PPP funding was only passed by like 6 senators were there when they passed that. Rand Paul was going to go your route, it looked like, and say there needs to be a recorded vote, but he ultimately didn't. What did you think of that whole situation? And do you see that repeating with this fourth package? I mean, Pelosi's saying over $1 trillion this could be. Do you think they're going to do the same type of procedure they did in the Senate with the CARES Act with this current package?
I think once you let something happen once, that becomes the standard way of doing it. So they will probably keep voice voting things in the Senate because they did it the first time. That's why it was so important for me on March 27th to stand up. This was the argument I was making, that if we let Nancy Pelosi pass one bill by unanimous consent, that now we had established a precedent and all of the other bills would go by unanimous consent with only Nancy Pelosi presiding and possibly 1 or 2 members present. So the precedent has already been set in the Senate, which is they're just going to stay home for the most part and voice vote it by unanimous consent. But I've established a precedent in the House that, by golly, you're going to have to come to work and you're going to have to vote.
Now, you've pointed out that this CARES Act is the largest rescue package in U.S. history. It's much larger than the Recovery Act. It's much larger than what was passed during the financial crisis. So when you look at these bills that are being proposed now, the fourth package, maybe even a fifth package, some members are talking about already, what's your projection for the national debt and the deficit? What are the numbers, do you think, by the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021?
Look, we're on a treadmill right now, and I predict that every 3 or 4 weeks, Congress is going to meet and pass another $1 trillion plus bill. They've already established that precedent. But here's the problem. We have a patient that's bleeding. That's our economy. And each of these bills is a blood transfusion. But the patient's arteries are severed, and we're not doing anything to help the actual condition of the patient. We're just keep giving them a blood transfusion, and the blood is just leaking out. There's no end in sight until we tie some of this money to the governors opening their states back up for business. That's the only way this thing comes back to normal. And the problem with that is it turns out the stimulus package or the bailout package, whatever you want to call it, is about 80% popular right now with the American people. Like, because it's popular to do these bailouts, congressmen are going to keep meeting and doing the bailouts. And I think the only thing that's going to snap people back to reality is when they go to the grocery store or when they go to their Walmart and the shelves are empty because people have been getting their money, but they haven't been going to work. That's what I think is going to bring everybody back to normal, is when they can't buy the things that they need at any price.
Yeah, because the stores are staying open right now. People are working in the grocery stores and for takeout with restaurants. So do you think that's affecting the thinking of the American people that, oh, I can go out and still do the things I need to do, and the Congress keeps helping us in the economy. So whether it opens soon or not, it seems like people might be accepting that. Is that kind of what you're saying? They're accepting this new normal and not thinking about the reopening enough?
So for most Americans, this isn't a big inconvenience yet, but for some Americans, it's a huge problem. Like the hairdresser who can't get the unemployment program and also can't get the PPP package. Now she has no way to provide for her family to buy the food in the grocery store. The problem is she's in the minority now. The government has bailed out everybody except for a few of those people. So those people that have the small businesses that create their own livelihoods, that have been deprived of a livelihood, obviously they want to get back to normal as soon as possible. But the others who can go on because they're getting paychecks, even if they're not going to work, they're not as concerned, but I think they will be concerned when they go to the grocery stores and they see shortages of certain food items that they were always able to get. When it starts looking like Soviet Russia at your local Kroger's, that's when it becomes a problem for them. Also, you're going to see shortages of basic things like dishwashers and refrigerators. When you go to buy those, they're going to be in short supply because the factories that are producing those, because they have like maybe 80% attendance, their assembly lines are running at 50% productivity, and that you just can't sustain that. So, if we're producing 50% as much as we used to, or 70% as much as we used to, eventually our quality of life, at least the part of it that's provided by tangible things, is going to go down to 50%. And people are going to start feeling that at some point. And that's when they'll start joining the hairdressers and the other sole proprietors who are having hardships. And that's when they'll push back against the governors to open all this back up.
Are you comfortable with some of these states announcing reopening plans without an actual vaccine in place for COVID-19?
Well, here's the irony of their reopening plans. We don't have herd immunity right now. No, given the estimates for this virus and the way it spreads, I've heard that we have to have like 70 to 80% of the people having been exposed to either a vaccine or the virus itself in order to obtain herd immunity. Well, I don't think we're at 10 or 20% yet. So we don't have herd immunity. So when they open the government back, or the economy back up, we're basically where we were 6 or 8 weeks ago when they shut it down epidemiologically, right? And so nothing's really changed. So what they're admitting is what they're telling us to do this week or next week is what they should have done 8 weeks ago, which is put a mask on and go to work.
So you think right now with these states who are reopening that it's appropriate to, put these plans into place, or would you like to see more done on the medical side before people start, going in to work, especially if you're in that high risk category, like
right,
over 65 years of age, you going to work? You think that's safe to do right now?
Well, my friend Daniel Horowitz just put out an article yesterday, and he said, open the beaches and lock down the nursing homes, because depending on the state, 30 to 60% of the deaths are all related to nursing homes. Like, people aren't dying at the beaches, and there's really not even any evidence that it's been spread at a park or a beach, but the nursing homes are being devastated. So why don't we protect those individuals and let everybody else go on with their lives?
I wanted to ask you about the fourth package that House Speaker Pelosi is talking about. There's going to be a substantial amount proposed for state and local governments to give them money. Some are calling it a bailout. Would you back something like that to replenish the money that states have lost, which is
No.
what she's advocating for? No, why not?
The only reason they're proposing the federal government do it instead of the state government do these bailouts is the federal government can print money and the states can't. And I mean, this is going to boomerang on us, and it's going to boomerang hard when all the printing and the borrowing and the loaning catches up to us. And the burden is going to be on the middle class, the productive members of society who go out and work every day, pay the bulk of the taxes. And that's who it's going to come down on. Also, we're causing or presenting a moral hazard for all of the governors. I always thought in the beginning, when they started shutting down states like Kentucky, that the governors, particularly our governor, would come to his senses when he didn't have the revenue to pay the state employees, because they would show up at the Capitol and they would be the ones protesting the governor because they weren't getting paid. And that would cause him to come to his senses and open the economy back up, because in fact, it's him who is depriving the state of the revenues, of the tax revenues. But what we're doing now when we bail out the states is we're telling the governors, keep doing what you're doing and we'll support it. Keep your states on lockdown. And that's the problem. And we're also presenting a problem for the governors, the brave governors like Kristi Noem, who've gone against the tide and kept their states open. We're punishing them when we bail out the states that are hurting their own people.
So how do you think it should have been handled from the beginning? Because this started with the federal government issuing these guidelines, and you've even heard some members say, well, we wanted the economy to shut down, the federal government, so we have to do something. We have to make it right. I mean, you've heard that many times. So what do you think should have been done? Do you think the economy should not have been, brought to a halt at all?
Yeah, absolutely. We should never have devastated our own economy. And whether you want to place the blame on the governors or maybe blame the president's advisors who were, advising these types of mitigation policies to the states, it doesn't matter. It was the wrong thing. Now, maybe we didn't have all the information we needed about this virus, and maybe it seemed like the right thing at the time, but we've got better information now. We know that people are not getting diagnosed for diabetes or breast cancer or heart disease. They're not even getting their teeth fixed at the dentist. And all of these health effects are adding up to be far more than what the virus is. So no, we shouldn't shut down the economy. Let's get it back open.
You've probably seen that the auto industry is talking about a possible federal rescue package. It seems like there are a lot of sectors that want more money, or just want money because they didn't get any from the federal government because of COVID-19. What do you think of the auto industry specifically trying to get money?
Well, any publicly traded company has an avenue for getting more money. That is, they have to sell their stock to raise capital. That's why they went public in the first place. So when you hear the airlines and the automobile companies coming to the federal government and asking for a bailout, what's happening there is the shareholders in that company know that their recourse to raising money is to dilute their own shares, and they don't want to dilute their own shares. In fact, a lot of times when they get the money, they buy shares back and they try to increase their ownership in the company. But what they're going to have to do is bite the bullet, go back into the public market and sell more shares in their company and share some of the future profits at the automobile companies or at the airlines with new shareholders. That's the way capitalism works. But right now we're saying if you buy shares in a company that you can enjoy the upside, but if the stock goes down too much, that will put that burden on the taxpayer. That's just not right. When you have capitalism on the upside and socialism on the downside, that's cronyism.
Now, during your congressional career, you've talked a lot about the national debt and the deficit, just the fiscal situation in the country. Given what's happening now with the spending on coronavirus, do you think fiscal conservatism in Congress is dead at this point? Or do you think there could be some sort of resurrection of, cutting back spending and limited government, or do you think that's kind of over at this point?
You know, I'm not sure what ideology would welcome the sort of policies that are being passed in Congress right now. I've decided that these aren't good Republican policies. These aren't good Democrat policies. These may be collapsitarian policies. If you're a collapsitarian, this is exactly what you'd want to see Congress doing. In other words, if you're rooting for the dollar to collapse, if you're rooting for the federal infrastructure to collapse, which I'm not, trust me, I'm not. That's why I'm against all these policies and the bills that are passing, but that's what they're leading us to. I do not see how you sustain sound money when you're printing money and loaning out money at this rate, while at the same time you are limiting the production of goods. I think we're going to see inflation. Now, we had a conference call with Chairman Powell the day before yesterday, the GOP did, and he assured us that they could wrestle inflation back in place if we ever saw it creeping up, but I'm not sure that we can.
The Fed is adding an unprecedented amount of money into the economy. How much do you think this is going to cost, all the coronavirus efforts in the end, in terms of the trillions of dollars? The president floated the $6 trillion number that it could cost. But I mean, I just keep seeing headline after headline of how much the Fed's doing in the economy. What's your projections from your knowledge and your call with the Fed chair?
Well, what the Fed is doing right now is a giant gamble. Congress is sending $2 trillion out the door, actually closer to $3 trillion now. And the Fed is going to loan out $4 trillion. Now, the Fed will tell you that those are safe investments and that everybody will get their money back. But if the money is paid back, then okay, only $3 trillion got spent. You don't have to count the $4 trillion at the Fed. But if those loans go bad, which is a distinct possibility in these uncharted, economic times, now this has been a $7 trillion bill instead of a $3 trillion bill so far. You can expect that we're going to spend at least this much more, okay, because we haven't even begun to do the things that need to happen yet. The governors are talking about opening the economy back up, but they're talking about doing it under limited circumstances, and they're all warning they will shut it right back down if they see an increase in the numbers of COVID infections. And there's no reason to believe that the numbers won't increase when they open it back up. So going down the V, we've spent $7 trillion spent or loaned. I think you can expect to see us spend or loan at least another $7 trillion. So 14 trillion, it rounded up to 20 trillion. We'll probably, if you count the extra stuff that's on the balance sheet at the Fed, we'll probably double the $20 trillion debt before this is over with.
That seems like an unsustainable number. Would you agree with that for the long term?
It's completely unsustainable. Again, the only people that can be rooting for these policies are collapsitarians or accelerationists. This is not sound policy, and it will catch up with us. Actually, the worst situation would be if 5 years from now, we're all paying 30% of our income in interest to somebody. But I don't know who we'd be paying it to. Who's going to loan it to us at some point? I think the interest rates are going to start going up. This was a discussion or concern that other members of the GOP expressed to Chairman Powell. By the way, behind closed doors, they seem like raging fiscal conservatives. It's only when they get to the floor and vote that they lose their minds and their principles. But behind the scenes on this conference call, they were all talking about the problems of inflation and the problem of when you borrow too much money without a sound plan for paying it back in a timely fashion, that interest rates inevitably have to go up. And I think you're going to see that too. You're going to see the rate, not just the debt go up, but the rate of interest that we have to pay on the debt is going to go up too. And when this is all over, we'll probably be paying at least as much interest as, $600 billion a year as we spend on the military.
How long do you think the U.S. will have before a financial meltdown?
I'm not a good predictor of these things. It's gone, I'm not going to make a guess about it. My hope is that we don't have a meltdown. My hope is that people come to their senses and start opening the economy back up in earnest, not halfway.
Hmm. Well, the Congress gave the Fed unprecedented power, right? In the CARES Act. They've never had so much power before in the economy.
They've never had this kind of power at the Fed or at the Treasury. They're essentially becoming investors in our private market, okay, in publicly traded stocks. And if there is a default, they're structuring the loan so that the federal government becomes owners of these companies, and so you're going to have people actually rooting for default. I think, not me, obviously, but I think this is a big transition in our country right now. It's equivalent to, or worse than, depending on worse than what that means, depending on your view of history, than the New Deal, than FDR's New Deal. I think in terms of spending, it's already greater than FDR's New Deal, accounting for inflation.
At what point do you think the American public pays more attention than they are now to the national debt and the deficit? Like, what do you think needs to happen where they'll say, whoa, this is an incredible amount of money and maybe we should begin to figure out ways to reduce the deficit?
I think it's only when the American consumers see shortages of essential items in their grocery stores that they will start to push back on their legislators and say, this is not what we want. And again, the bailout or the stimulus bill, whatever you want to call it, right now they're popular. If you poll the American public, it's 80% plus. These bills are popular. And so you could blame my colleagues in Congress, but they're actually just doing what the people want them to do. Now, the problem is my colleagues, when they got elected, they had an obligation to participate in a republic, not a democracy. And what that means is they should have not just taken on populist voting positions, that they should be evaluating the long-term economic effects and the constitutionality of what they're voting on. And I think they've forgotten that.
And you've also probably read about with the PPP program, these huge companies. We've had these large companies get money, forgivable loans, but the disclosure is voluntary right now. Do you think if Congress passes any other bill, they should be requiring the government to disclose who these companies are that got the federal forgivable loans?
I think it should all be transparent. At the Fed, they promise that they will be transparent and that they will let us know who gets their loans that they're issuing at the Fed. Some of those will be on a delay. The transparency will be delayed. I guess they're trying not to affect the markets too much by disclosing what they're doing. All of the PPP should be disclosed. Of course, that wasn't in the bill. The only reason that we know that several dozen of these large companies received it is that they're publicly traded companies and they have to disclose their financials. And that's how we found out about the money that was supposed to go to small companies going to companies that have hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue every year. Transparency would be nice, but what would be better is if we just quit giving away the money. I mean, I'd like to know how many dead people got $1,200 checks. I know of half a dozen in my congressional district. People have told me their parent, that passed away in 2018 or 2019, received a check or received an electronic transfer into a joint account that was still open. How much of that's going on? I don't think this stuff's going to be audited. Now the government's trying to get those checks back. Instead of asking dead people to send their checks back, it would have been a lot easier just not to send the checks to the dead people. But they're in such a rush to get this money out, whether it's the $1,200 checks or the $600 a week or the PPP, that all of the normal and regular and common sense questions you would ask before you send the money out the door have been short-circuited.
Yeah, I've been doing reports on how deceased people, inmates, even foreign workers are getting deposits in their account, a check. So we'll see if they actually go back and they audit that. It's an interesting situation that they've got themselves involved in.
Well, in the aggregate, you need to understand that the purpose of those 1,200 checks was twofold. First of all, there was the sense that families needed something to support them in these times. But I think the bigger purpose in Congress is that they just wanted to stimulate the economy. Look, President Bush did this and sent out $600 checks, if you remember. And at least back then, the stated purpose was to goose the economy, to try and get the economy going again. So that's what they're doing now. I have a friend who's a multimillionaire who texted me and told me he didn't just get the $1,200 check, he got the full amount for his family, $3,400. And it's because the threshold is based on adjusted gross income, and the type of income, or investments he has didn't show up. And so they don't take into account how much money you already have when they send you the $1,200 for you and your spouse, and then the money for your kids.
Yeah, I thought that was based on income. It's interesting that he got that full amount.
He spends more on a party in one night than those checks are, I can tell you.
Well, Congressman, the last question I had for you was about China. You've probably seen Senator Blackburn. She's been pushing for restitution, that China should forgive the portion of U.S. debt that they hold. Would you get behind something like that? Should there be some sort of legislative action to get China to pay restitution, forgive the debt, for example?
The problem with that, when you start telling your creditors that you're not going to pay them back, is the other creditors start getting worried. And then when you go look for more creditors, they raise your interest rate. That's the problem with the state and local governments going bankrupt. That means that now and forever, when they go to borrow more money, the interest rates will be higher. But since you mentioned Senator Marsha Blackburn, I want to give her a shout out. She's a co-sponsor of a bill that I wrote. There's 30 some sponsors in the House, and there are 4 sponsors in the Senate that would let local American-owned meat processors process meat from our local farms. Because right now, there are 4 companies, and one of them is Chinese, that process 80% of the meat in this country. And so, if you want to talk about China, let's talk about taking them out of our food supply here in the United States and letting farmers sell directly to consumers using local processing plants instead of having to go through these Chinese plants. And so my hat's off to Marsha Blackburn for co-sponsoring that bill that would let American processors process the beef by rolling back some of the regulations that have heretofore kept them out of this market.
If it's determined that China was indeed the source of the virus and they dropped the ball, is there any form of restitution that the U.S. could lead the charge to get them to pay? I mean, the whole world really has come to a standstill over this coronavirus situation.
Well, I think we should have oversight hearings on this. Let's get to the facts. I'd rather know what exactly the facts are and bring some witnesses in and have them testify. I saw an article in Newsweek that said Dr. Fauci was overseeing research on coronaviruses to try and see how you could accelerate the spread of a coronavirus. Again, that was in Newsweek. I don't know if it's true or not. I would like to have some congressional hearings to find that out. Did the American taxpayer actually fund virus research that might have contributed to this? Because the article contends some of that money went to the lab in Wuhan, China, some of the American taxpayer money. So let's find out all the dependencies. Let's find out everybody who's culpable in this, mainly not to seek restitution or to go back on somebody, but looking forward, let's not make the same mistakes.
Congressman, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Make sure you sign up for our newsletter at justthenews.com and follow us on social media. I'm Nicholas Ballasy. Thanks for watching and have a great day.